And this is an audio test for the simulcast on YouTube. And this is an audio test for the simulcast on YouTube. And this is an audio test for the simulcast on YouTube. And this is an audio test for the simulcast on YouTube. And this is an audio test for the simulcast on YouTube. Okay, we're 30 seconds away. Patty, I can hear you. Glad everything is working. Okay, we're 30 seconds away. Okay, folks, Patty, in about 20 seconds, I'm going to hit the record button to get started. Thanks so much for being here. Glad everything is working. Okay, we're 30 seconds away. Okay, folks, Patty, in about 20 seconds, I'm going to hit the record button to get started. Thanks so much for being here. Glad everything is working. Okay, we're 30 seconds away. Okay, folks, Patty, in about 20 seconds, I'm going to hit the record button to get started. Thanks so much for being here. Okay, we're 30 seconds away, folks. Patty, in about 20 seconds, I'm going to hit the record button to get started. Thanks so much for being here. And Patty, I think I'll have you turn your mic off just for the first few slides because I do hear a little bit of background noise. Perfect. And Patty, I think I'll have you turn your mic off just for the first few slides because I do hear a little bit of background noise. Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and welcome to Library 2.018, Social Crisis Management in a 21st Century World. Hi, it's Steve Hargadon. We're so delighted to have you here. Patty, Ryan, and Madeline are here. We'll have them introduce themselves in a minute. Thanks to San Jose State University School of Information, the founding partner for the conference. It's been a terrific relationship, and we're just delighted with the quality of these events. Those of you who are participating in the room live can now actually indicate where you are in the world. Look to the left of the map for the star icon. Click on it twice live. Click on the map, and maybe put a note in the chat as well. People would probably love to hear what time it is, where you are, and what the weather is like. People would probably love to hear. I know we have New Zealand. It looks like Australia, Europe. People would probably love to hear. I know we have New Zealand. It looks like Australia, Ocean, lots of North America. Wherever you're participating from, we're sure delighted to have you here. Keep those notes going in the chat, and we're going to move the slide forward. Wherever you're participating from, we're sure delighted. I'd like to introduce Dr. Sandra Hirsch, who's the co-chair of the conference. Sandy?
Hi, everyone. I am very pleased to welcome all of you to the Library 2.018 Conference on Social Crisis Management in a 21st Century World. I'm the director of the San Jose State School of Information, and we are so pleased to continue to offer these important virtual conference sessions, and it's really exciting to see so many people participate from all around the world, even when it's not great timing for you. We're really pleased to welcome all of you. I'm also excited about the speakers that we have today, and I also want to give a special shout out to Patricia Wong, who has really been instrumental in helping us organize the speakers and the content for this particular event. She not only teaches for us as an adjunct in our school, but she is the director of the San Monica Public Library. So we're really pleased to be working with her on this conference. So again, welcome. I think we have a great lineup for everyone, and I'd like to pass it on to Sophie along with a great program. Again, welcome to everyone. I'd like to
thanks, Dr. Hirsch, and we'll now turn the time over to Patty.
Greetings, everyone.
Thanks, Dr. Hirsch, and
welcome to Social Crisis Management in a 21st Century World. We have some great speakers lined up for you. I'd like to take the time now to introduce myself. I am the city librarian, and we have some great speakers in California. I've had a lot of experience working through social issues in each of the different organizations I've worked with in California, and I am pleased to share the time with you. And maybe Ryan, if you could take the mic and introduce yourself, and I'll ask Madeline to do the same, and then I'll introduce yourself. And maybe Ryan,
good morning, good evening, good whatever, wherever you are. Good to talk to everybody. My name is Ryan Dowd. Just kind of two quick things about me. I started volunteering at my local homeless shelter when I was 13. Started working there 21, became executive director when I was 26, and so this is more or less all I've ever done is work at one of the largest homeless shelters in Illinois in the United States. A few years ago, I got connected with libraries, started training librarians on how to manage problematic behavior compassionately from homeless, affected, mentally ill, traumatized patrons. That led to me being able to work with that ALA to write the Best Librarian's Guide to Homelessness. And again, really excited about that led to me being able to work with that.
Hi, thanks, Ryan. My name is Madeline Ildefonso, and I'm a managing librarian for the Office of Enrichment, which means I'm the manager for the New American Centers, and American Librarian, Los Angeles Public Library. I've been with the library system for almost 14 years. Most of them spent in public-facing institutions and a variety of library systems for almost 14 years. Most of them spent in public-facing institutions and a variety of library systems.
Thanks, Madeline and Ryan. And I wanted to introduce Rebecca Smith Aldrich, and I know she won't be joining us in the keynote. She'll be wrapping up a little bit later, but to give you a little bit of a preview, and I know Rebecca is the executive director of the Stockton-San a little bit later, and one of the things that she's most known for is her work around sustainability, and now, more than ever, on a million and really to have a wide range of experiences in how libraries are working within social issues, and she will be wrapping up specifically to talk about how libraries can be more resilient to what seems to be sometimes a disparate range of services that we have to offer, and how there can be self-care and care for the organization integrated in that range of services. So let's get started. I wanted to talk a little bit about how we came to this, and thanks again to Dr. Hirsch, San Jose State University, in particular the iSchool for putting this together. The entire world has changed for libraries. Our human condition has changed dramatically. There's implications for libraries of all types on a global scale. There's food insecurity now, there's hunger, housing policies, there's implications for libraries, violence, mental health service needs, social, economic, educational, and racial equity and disparities along those lines, substance abuse and drug overdose, all of these many challenges impact the team and disparities along those lines as customers, students, as faculty, and as staff. So we have to make some operational decisions, and those are all influenced in terms of influenced by social concerns. So library work, I would share with you, indeed is community work. All of those social and community factors affect all of us as humans at all levels and throughout our life experience. And people come to libraries for many different reasons. So there's a new normal now, a tension and a paradox between the service of 5 years ago and that of today. So we've had to develop different kinds of services. Our decisions are made based on those service needs and who is coming into our buildings and who we impact every day. The community expectations of libraries has maintained the same, but we have a changing reality now. So we still are thought of in many ways to be information gateways, to be brokers of the spoken word and the written word, and to be engaged in a lot of different activities having to do with literacy and education, but we have a changing dynamic of who's coming into our buildings and what their needs happen to be. So many of us are becoming service providers or engaging with service providers to provide additional different services, as well as being bridges to those services that we can't provide directly. Today, we're going to be hearing a lot about models of effective change management and social equity in addition to the services that we are providing and as a basis for the results of those services. You're going to be hearing a lot of stories of responsiveness, collective impact, and partnerships to develop new and emerging services, some innovation, above all, flexibility and design thinking, and a way of thinking about library services from a much more organic process. And lastly, with our final speaker of the day, sustainability and resiliency. So with that, I'm going to just share a very short story. I wouldn't be remiss if I didn't talk about my own story, which is that right now, Santa Monica Public Library. So the city of Santa Monica is home to about 1,500 homeless individuals at our last homeless count. There's a citywide focus on homeless services. And indeed, part of our dynamic and part of our response is one of relentless support and engagement. We believe that actually all of our staff, all 2,050 of them, full-time staff and about 200 part-time staff, all have a responsibility to touch the lives of our homeless community members. And we believe in collaborative partnership with first responders, human services, and all of our nonprofits. So how does the library fit into all of this great circle of service? With 1,000 to 1,500 people remaining homeless in our community, the Santa Monica Public Library continues to be the one location where they can count on feeling welcome and being welcomed and comfortable and engaging in a way that where no one's looking over their shoulder all the time and there isn't a charge for admission. So we provide space and support for all. We are in the process of hiring a social worker to be able to actively work with all of our community members. We have one main library and 4 branches, so one person spread between all of those locations is not very easy to do, but we try to maintain a presence at all of our locations. We have an outreach worker who does case management, information, and referral with one of our local providers, the People Concerned, and she actually touches more than about 500 people every month. Many of them come from all different walks of life. A lot of the services they provide are anything from replacing Social Security cards to getting California IDs, to food security and actually actively looking for shelter and transitional and permanent housing. To date, she's actually, in the very short time that she's worked with us, she's been able to successfully pair housing with individuals who are seeking that to more than 24 people. So that's a bit of the way that the library is able to make a commitment to this effort. We house pop-up resource fairs, which means probably a dozen service providers come and join us once a month to open our doors and have everyone welcome and to engage in a way that is welcoming and friendly for all of the people who are frequenting our building. And then lastly, one of the things that we do quite a bit is information and training for staff in our community. A lot of our community members are uncertain of what to do. And they are both empathetic with the situation of our homeless community, but they're also fearful of overstepping, and they're not sure of how to engage. And so our outreach caseworker actually does quite a bit of that as well, and we're hoping the social worker will do the same. Staff training has always been a very difficult process because the staff also come from that standpoint that they didn't sign up for this, that social services and social provision of social services is not something that they were trained to do, nor is it something that they desire to do. And so one of the things you're going to hear about a little bit later in Ryan's presentation is we are actively using his training in all of our work. And it's really created a sense of calm and a sense of confidence for the staff in dealing with just about almost every situation that they've encountered. The other thing that we're doing that you might find useful in your own world is data tracking. How many people are coming in? What kinds of services are we able to provide? Who is asking for that service without confidentiality being breached, because that's a very important part of what libraries do. But having a bigger picture of who's coming in and how we can assist them. We do have library service officers who create a uniformed presence. So it's both, there's a safety and a welcoming atmosphere for everyone, and everyone understands what our rules of behavior are. And then, of course, we have had to be a little bit more consistent in terms of our application of behavior rules, but also with compassion. So that's our Santa Monica Public Library story. You have information about me, and I'm happy to share any of those things with you. But I think what's going to be very welcoming now is that Ryan Dowd is going to be talking about his experience. And his, many of us, you know, when Ryan and I were talking about engaging in this process, he said, you know, you have all the rock stars of social issues and libraries kind of at the forefront. And we do indeed. And Ryan is among those rock stars that is doing a lot of critical work based on his own experience, but also as a really beacon of the way things should be done within our homeless community. And I will turn it over to Ryan now.
Thank you, Patty. All right, let me jump in there. I just want to offer a little bit different perspective in the sense that I don't work in a library. I've never worked in a library. I'm not a librarian. And so my perspective is very much as an outsider, and so hopefully I can lend a perhaps different perspective than you might have seen. So oftentimes librarians are seen as curators of books, curators of information, of programs and whatnot. But I want to offer that perhaps there's another role you guys play that is equally important of curation, and possibly even more important than the other ways you curate. And that's a curator of interactions between people, and possibly even a curator of relationships. And I don't mean relationships in dating or marriage sense, but relationships in the sense of actually getting to talk to someone that you might never have actually had an opportunity to speak to or interact with in any other context. So here's how I get at that. Now, if you've not seen yet the trailer for Emilio Estevez's new movie, The Public, you should absolutely hop on YouTube and go watch it. The trailer is fantastic. The movie's even better. If you're wondering when the movie's coming out, the answer is I don't know. Hopefully soon, but don't have a date yet. So keep an eye out for that. The movie will be out at some point. But there's a scene in there that's particularly important, I think. And there's a scene where Jeffrey Wright's character is talking to a police officer, and he says that libraries are the last true bastion of democracy in our country. And that really resonated with me. And it resonated with me in ways that might not have been obvious. And obviously you guys are important for democracy, for information, and for challenging fake news and access to these resources that are free and available to the public. But you guys are also one of the last institutions in most countries, and particularly in the United States for sure, where you're one of the last institutions where different socioeconomic groups all come together in the same place, in the same building. That just doesn't happen hardly anywhere else in the way that it used to happen in our country. It doesn't happen in churches like it used to. It doesn't happen in schools. It doesn't happen in neighborhoods, which are increasingly segmented by socioeconomic status. We've done such a great job in our country of what's called economic apartheid. Economic apartheid is the idea that we just kind of keep everybody separate. So, poor people, you can live over there on the other side of the train tracks. That's what's zoned for you. And middle class people, you can have here around the malls. And, wealthy people, you've got over behind your walls and your gates over there. And we keep everybody separate. Except that, again, libraries are one of those last institutions where all the different socioeconomic groups meet in one singular building. There's not a separate one if you're wealthy, a separate one if you're middle class, and a separate one if you're poor. Everybody congregates in the public library, in one public library. And that means two things. First is you guys are critical to democracy. And what I mean by that is that when middle class and wealthy individuals don't have an opportunity to interact with, to meet with people who are poor or homeless or not like them in any other type of way, those individuals make really lousy voting decisions. They make really lousy policy decisions, and our democracies go off the tracks. And the second thing that means is, holy cow, that is a ton of room for conflict. When you've got a middle class and wealthy patron base that is interacting with poor and homeless individuals for the first time in their lives, and they don't have to in any other institution in their lives. They don't have to in the stores they shop in the churches they go to, etc. And they start to say things like, why are you letting those people into my library that was paid for by my tax dollars? And you guys are kind of stuck in the middle trying to somehow mediate this interaction between socioeconomic groups that doesn't happen anywhere else, and that's just a lot of room for conflict. And so what that means is, you guys need different tools, new tools. There's tools for curating books. There's tools for curating information. There's tools for curating programming, but there's also tools for curating relationships. Now, I have like 10 minutes left, so I'm going to give you like a super short 10-minute version of something I've done in literally as a 10-hour training. And so this is just we're going to skip a rock across the surface and talk about kind of one specific area that matters. And that's it. We need to learn to fully embrace and fully understand diversity in all of its ways. Most forms of diversity are fairly obvious. Diversity in race, in gender, in national origin, in language, etc. But also socioeconomic status diversity and housing status diversity. And here's how this tends to play out. There's a fair amount of research around how individuals learn to appreciate and communicate with effectively individuals who are not like them, individuals who are different in some way, whether that's, again, socioeconomic status, race, religion, national origin, etc. And we tend to start in kind of this stage of, for lack of a better term, of bigotry, where we look at others that are different than us, and we view them as absolute other. They're different, they're alien, and we judge them, and we look at them as bad. So, the United States right now is going through a really, really bad period of Islamophobia, and racism seems more prevalent now than it's been in I don't know how long. And so in many ways, at least the United States feels very much trapped in this status of othering others, looking at people who are different than us and saying, wow, you are just wholly different. You are something less than fully human. And so the first step is to actually appreciate our common humanity. And so when talking to homeless individuals and talking about individuals experiencing homelessness, there's this notion that we have to help other patrons to appreciate that common humanity and recognize that homeless people are people first. And this is shockingly, surprisingly necessary for many people. We had a politician once come into our shelter, and he walked in and he looked around the room, and it was crowded, and we had 100+ people in the room. And he looked at me and he said, "These people don't look homeless." And I kind of asked him quizzically, what, I don't know what you're expecting. If you're expecting, purple skin and a horn on their heads and a tail and perhaps wings, but homeless people tend to look like people. And so, helping others to appreciate that homeless individuals, they have a birth date, they have a favorite book, they have parents, obviously, and oftentimes siblings, just like everybody else, and a favorite movie, and disappointments about the past, just like you, and dreams for the future, just like you. And so we have to first help people overcome that tendency to look at people who are different than others and us, and just kind of really separate them out as a separate category. Now, that much is fairly obvious. I think most anybody who's chosen to be on this conference is probably going to appreciate that we need to help others to appreciate the common humanity of people who are not like us, particularly or even if they're not like us socioeconomically. What's a little more complicated is the next step. And it's that we actually have to appreciate the diversity, and we have to appreciate the differences that diversity bring. And so while, step 2 is a step up from bigotry, where we look at difference and diversity and we kind of appreciate that shared humanity, the common humanity, there is a step up from that where we look at difference and diversity and we say, it's okay if you're different. It's okay. Diversity is not just, I guess it's not just okay, it's actually fantastic. And if you are different than me and you look at the world a little differently than I do, and you communicate a little differently than I do, and some different things upset you than I do, and you've had different experiences than I have, then that's okay. And this is where it actually starts to get, this is where a lot of my work is focused, is helping a librarian base that is by and large middle class. I know that's not 100% true. There are librarians that were raised in poverty. There are librarians that were raised in wealth. But I also know statistically that the vast majority of librarians were recruited from the middle class, just like the vast majority of every other profession. And so a lot of my work is helping individuals in library land who were raised in a middle class home to appreciate those slight subtle differences of individuals who are raised in poverty. Because if you can't appreciate those differences, you can't fully empathize, and you can't fully appreciate how they look at the world and how they communicate and how those things might be different. Because it turns out those slight differences are the key to empathy. If I'm talking to somebody who's just like me, they're a 40-year-old bald white guy who has a law degree and works in a homeless shelter, if I'm talking to somebody like that, it doesn't require a lot of imagination on my part to figure out exactly how does he communicate, how does he look at the world, etc. But if I'm talking to a 90-year-old immigrant from Guatemala who's HIV positive and struggles with, has an amputee, if I'm talking to someone like that, there are substantial differences between them and me. And if I don't appreciate those differences, if I don't acknowledge those differences, I'm going to project all of my privilege onto them. I'm going to assume that they have they look at the world exactly like me, they communicate exactly like me, they've had every privilege that I've had. And this is where we tend to find individuals saying things like, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, just get a job. I struggled too, and I did just fine. Well, if you don't appreciate those differences, you actually can do a lot of damage. And so, again, the first step is to recognize our common humanity. But the second step then is to appreciate those differences and those diversity and how that plays out. So let me just, with my remaining 4 minutes or so here, let me just talk about a couple real quick that we tend not to see as obvious. The first set is around triggers. Triggers are things that just really upset you, and everybody's got something that really, really upsets you. One of mine is people who mistreat the vulnerable. But a common trigger for individuals experiencing homelessness is physical touch, and that arises from trauma. If you've experienced physical trauma in the past, if you have been sexually assaulted, if you have been beaten, if you've been mugged, if you've been molested, if you've had physical trauma against your person, and 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, a librarian walks up behind you and very well-meaning puts his or her hand on your shoulder, that oftentimes is a trigger. It kind of brings back all the emotions of the past trauma, and that person has an emotional reaction to this physical touch that is very, very different than someone who's not experienced all that trauma in the past. And if you as a librarian do not appreciate those differences as to why someone would absolutely flip out on you for merely placing your hand on your shoulder in a very friendly manner, basically what's happening there is you're failing to appreciate that person's experienced profound trauma, and that trauma physically changes the brain. And so we have to appreciate those differences. And one of those differences is trauma, and many homeless individuals have experienced trauma. Another trigger for many homeless individuals is unfairness. And oftentimes, homeless individuals have a hyper fixation on fairness that seems at times absurd. In the shelter, it'll manifest itself in some ways that seem absurd, where someone's freaking out about, why did I only get 1 scoop of potatoes and they got 2 scoops of potatoes, and this hyper fixation on fairness can seem very, very odd until you back up and you start to appreciate how they experience the world differently than you do, in the sense that homeless individuals experiencing homelessness, are faced with unfairness on a way higher rate than non-homeless individuals. When I do trainings, I poll the audience, who jaywalks? Everybody raises their hand. And I say, who's been ticketed for jaywalking? In a typical crowd, nobody will raise their hand. And I'll ask, who's used the bathroom at a fast food restaurant and not purchased something? And everybody raises their hand. And I say, okay, and now who's used the bathroom at a fast food restaurant and been chased out by a manager? And again, usually nobody, or 1 or 2 people raise their hand. And then I ask, who's gone into a park and stared at the flowers and the trees and the squirrels? And again, everybody raises their hand. And I say, who's been ticketed for loitering or chased out for loitering? And again, typically 1 or no people raise their hand. But if you went into a homeless shelter and you did the same quiz, everybody's jaywalked, of course, but half of them have been ticketed for it. Everybody's used the bathroom at a fast food restaurant, and 3/4 have been chased out by a manager. Everybody sat around in a park and stared at the flowers, the trees, and the squirrels, and probably 90 to 100% have been chased out of that park or ticketed for loitering. And so it is. Homeless individuals face an enormous amount of discrimination because of their poverty, because of their housing status. And when you're facing that level of discrimination on a day after day after day basis in so many of your interactions, oftentimes, you start to fixate on fairness because life is just so profoundly unfair. And again, this is one of those places where if we project our world where we're not being treated unfairly nearly as often as they are, we will fail to appreciate why many homeless individuals have this hyper-attentiveness, hyper-fixation on fairness. And that is, I think, all I have time for. So I'll stop there. If anybody wants to follow up with me later, my email address is ryan@homelesslibrary.com. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. That was wonderful. The complexity of our current condition in terms of dealing with communities of all shapes and sizes is also brought home with Madeline Ildefonso's presentation, and specifically on the needs of immigrants and refugees that have come into our communities and our and are part of our communities. So Madeline, with that, I'm going to turn that over to you now.
Great, thanks, Patty. I'm just waiting for my slides. Oh, here we are. Okay, there we all are. Okay, well, thank you, Patty, and thank you, Ryan. I guess I'll just start. I feel lucky to work in a progressive city like Los Angeles, and for a like-minded institution like LAPL, which has prioritized services to immigrant families. The immigration services landscape is constantly changing these days. Right now, there are 3 proposed changes from the Department of Homeland Security, and you can read more about these proposed changes and find resources in PLA Connect Citizenship and Immigration Group. But it is hard to keep up and know how you can interact with this highly specialized information with a really vulnerable population. And here, we're learning how because we've moved from the referral space into more of an action space. So Los Angeles is home to more than 700,000 green card holders and several 100,000 residents without status. And there are a high number of mixed status families in California. So what we're really looking at is how we can help entire families, not only individuals. This all started back in 2012 with the launch of our Path to Citizenship program, which featured citizenship corners in classes as well as a staff education piece. Since that time, our library system has hosted almost 6,000 citizenship programs, which have been attended by more than 56,000 people. And librarians have answered almost 72,000 questions about citizenship. But the success of this program is what eventually led to an expanded idea of what it means to provide services to immigrants, where the timing of the launch of this program actually ended up becoming a response to a national issue. So what this picture is right here you see is in January of 2018, we launched the New Americans Initiative, and it's comprised of several programs. The 2 most prominent are citizenship classes, which we mostly offer in English, but we are going to start offering them in Spanish, and on-site immigration services. And those take place in our New American centers, which are in 6 branches throughout the city. We have highly trained library staff who've gone through the Department of Justice training to be accredited representatives, as well as accredited staff working alongside our partners. And this closeness has helped us learn so much more than what we just trained to learn. And it's going to help inform how we make our decisions about the program moving forward. We also reimagined our citizenship corners, which are now known as the New Americans Welcome Stations. And you can see those in the right-hand corner of the slide. It's actually a mobile shelving unit, and it's pretty large. It's over 5 feet tall. And it houses all the materials that a person may need to prepare for naturalization. And while they're really big and some of our smaller branches don't maybe fit as well as one might like, it creates a really intentional message of value for the services and the information that we provide. And so really the heart of the work is to support community. And so just to give you an idea of the things that are offered in our New American centers and some of the other work that we're doing, one of the first things we did, and I think a lot of other libraries were doing this work around Know Your Rights sessions, we weren't able to get enough cards to pass out. So we actually, we print our own, and we got, we hustled and got 19 translations from places all over the state because the language needs that we have are so big, it wasn't enough for us to just have, 5 or 6 languages. So that's something that we did on our own. But in these centers, you can find people to talk to about guardianship. They can meet with housing rights attorneys. You can sign up for financial coaching. You can sign up for small business assistance. There's a lot of access to a lot of different services that we're providing in these centers. One of the big things that we are really proud of is that we're able to, people are able to schedule appointments online. And so that's been a really important piece for busy people to be able to schedule that time to talk to somebody. And starting soon, we'll offer additional appointment services with community educators. We will be able to meet with individuals and just answer a really wide array of questions and provide additional support. And lastly, I think that our successes with this program, I want to make sure I mention that it's really rooted in our ability to work alongside our partners and our staff and their support of this work, which comes from a place of education. That's really essential. So I really like this graphic slide that my friend Helen Chu from Houston Public made for a presentation we did together. So I've borrowed it for this one. But as seen here, these are what we like to think as the key elements to consider for services to immigrant populations. In Los Angeles, we're able to articulate and act in every petal of this flower, if you will. But a program can be made up of only a few elements, of pieces of each petal. And they're all interconnected. And so there's just things to evaluate before you consider building a program. And it's really important to build on small successes. There are things that you can do that are small scale around the space of welcoming and fraud. So notario fraud is something that's alive and well all over the country. And I think that as people who work in the area of civics and helping communities prevent this from happening, that's something that it's a really comfortable space for us to do programming in if you're not in a library where you can do a lot of work in the services for immigrants area. And I think that, something I think about that as information professionals, it's easy to fall into the trap that resource lists and referrals are always the best answers. And they're important answers, but if you can't do all the things, it's still worth it to do smaller things. And I'd say that, in times of crisis, the answer is bigger than a sheet of paper and services, that your service can be based in humility and the assets of the community. And that can still be really important work that you're doing. Which just leads me to building blocks. So in order to determine what elements of a program you'd like to develop, it's really important to think about the people who are in your neighborhood, so to speak. Green card holders have different concerns than refugees. Refugees are not asylees. So familiarizing yourself, but also understanding who is living in the area where you're working is going to help inform the decisions about the programs you'd like to produce and support. And rather than just building a program on deficits, building one based on assets. For example, like entrepreneurship is a place where a lot of immigrant populations really excel in building businesses and small businesses. And focusing programming to support small business is something that benefits everybody, but it's also building on assets from a community rather than deficits. And I also wanted to touch on coverage and capacity. So thinking about what is your institution's ability to support programming capacity-wise. So, for us, it's not possible to do things in 72 locations. And our partners are really, really busy doing a ton of work right now. And so capacity is an issue for everybody. So how well you're able to do something and meet a community need, but also providing coverage. And I don't mean coverage at the reference desk if you step off to do a program, but can you provide services or information without highlighting the vulnerability of a group? We found that a lot of people were not showing up for Know Your Rights events. It's something that we've had more success with in a more individualized environment because people don't want to highlight that they need to talk to somebody about this. So you can consider different programs and where you can kind of the intersectionality and where you can intersperse information that's helpful, but that the program isn't, the primary purpose of the program isn't highlighting the vulnerability of a population. And for key skills, it's just to always be open and flexible because the process of program development is super iterative. So, it's always good to have a couple of plans, and to keep a dialogue open so you're always learning from what's happening in your facilities with staff and some partners. And lastly, I just wanted to highlight some places to get information from. There is an immigration and citizenship group, as I mentioned earlier, through PLA Connect. And these are just some websites and some, you can subscribe to alerts and announcements. And just to make sure, you know, the space that you're looking at is one of gathering information. And there are resources that, if you can make available to the public. But, you know, you should never be offering advice to people unless you have the training and accreditation to do so. So you want to make sure you want to focus on making sure people connecting with the services that they need. But you on the back end can be really informed about what those services could be that people or organizations provide, and kind of what the landscape is and concerns that people may have. So that's just really something I would like to highlight, because it's a really complex universe, this immigration work, and so you want to be cautious but aware. And that's all I have today.
Thank you, Madeline. That was great. One of the things that we're going to do a little differently now is we're going to open up to having a conversation with Ryan and Madeline about how things have changed for libraries. Ryan's going to be talking about it, obviously, from the perspective as a partner, and Madeline from the perspective as someone in the front lines, and how, in their experience, social issues have changed the way we do things in libraries. So we've got a few questions, but there will be other questions that come up. In your experiences as partner and a librarian, and Ryan and Madeline, if you want to just also take the mic, how have libraries changed and adapted services to address social issues that impact our current and future communities?
I guess we don't all jump in at once. It's a big question, Patty. I think that for us, in Los Angeles, one way we've adapted to address is the social issues is that we're actually providing more services on site. And so for our work with people who are on house, we have an event called The Source, which happens in this library location, which is Central Library in downtown Los Angeles, but also in several other branch facilities. And it's not just a connect day where we're bringing resources together. People actually receive services on site, so that means that they're getting that housing there, or they're you know, with the medical provider, they're actually like getting that service in the library. And that can make a difference from sending people to a lot of different places for services. So I think, you know, in that way, really providing services for people who are in our facilities when they're in our facilities puts the library in a different place in the community. I think that's been one shift that we've made here in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I think some of the changes are going to be fairly obvious. You know, the changes in programming, you know, adding social workers, adding clothes closets, adding, food pantries, adding all these different services. But then also going out into the community. So, you know, our local library comes out to us in the shelter. I've talked to other libraries that actually have a librarian embedded within a shelter a certain number of hours a week. And I think that's probably a pretty fundamental change that you wouldn't have seen, you know, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Those are more obvious, though. What I think is probably more interesting is some of the more subtle questions, like what type of person is being recruited into libraries now? There might be a slightly different personality. I think that you know, libraries have always had a social justice bent to them, but probably more so now than ever. I think conflict de-escalation is a skill, so it's probably more important now than ever. And so the types of individuals that choose librarianship as a profession, and the type of individuals who choose to stay in the library versus choose that this is not what I signed up for. I think there's probably some profound changes there. I think there's probably some profound changes in how libraries manage employees, because it's a very, very difficult job now. Dealing with a wide array of the public, from someone who's intoxicated to someone who struggles with schizophrenia to someone who is an ornery millionaire to a bunch of teenage kids to whatever. That's really, really hard. And so libraries have to look at, how do we staff? Who do we hire? How do we compensate? How do we train people? How do we do physical layout of the building differently than we might have done it differently? And so than we might have done it before. So there's a lot of smaller questions, maybe smaller is not the right word, but less obvious differences that I think libraries around the world, at least particularly in the United States, but I suspect probably around the world, are really having to wrestle with and grapple with and talk to each other about and figure out, knowing that it's going to look different in every community. It's going to look different in Los Angeles than how it's going to look in Des Moines, Iowa, or in a library in Bangladesh, or et cetera. So it's a fascinating time.
So I'm going to take a couple of questions as we come through them from the audience as well. So Ryan and Madeline, you might want to weigh in this, but maybe mostly for Ryan. Karen is with an academic library. She has homeless and or lower income visitors also, less so than public libraries, but something we have to pay attention to. And I don't know if you have any experience with that, Ryan, or any comments for Karen?
Yeah, no, we actually work with a lot of academic libraries, particularly community colleges, where the community college is one of the public spaces and alongside the public library that gets a lot of individuals who have nowhere else to go during the day. And so, yeah, no, they face probably not the same volume that public libraries have, but substantively many of the same issues. At least that's the people I've talked to.
And Karen, just as a heads up, Peggy Cabrera and the San Jose State University, they have an upcoming session on how they're dealing with homeless students and food insecurity. So you might want to tune into that too. Let's see, Carla has a question. How do you deal with patrons who are angry about there being homeless people in the library? Sometimes they say we should kick them out because all I do is sleep in the library.
Yeah, so sometimes non-homeless people are harder to deal with than homeless people, and this is one of those cases. Generally, I recommend a two-pronged, two-part response, and it's to get at the two types of issues that people are raising, and one of those is legitimate and one of those is not. The legitimate issue is some individuals are asking, are you going to keep me safe? Is this a safe environment for me to bring my children here, or are you going to let anything go? I think the implication is, are you so liberal that you're going to let homeless people do whatever they want? And so there's a semi-legitimate fear there that the library is not going to enforce rules and it's going to allow an unsafe environment. But alongside that, there's a group of concerns that are less legitimate, and that is that some people feel entitled to never have to see poverty, to never have to witness poverty. I've talked to people who say how much it just stinks for them that they have to see homeless people. And I said, well, if you think it stinks for you to see homeless people, how do you think they feel being homeless? And with those group of concerns, I have no sympathy whatsoever. If you don't like witnessing poverty, then you don't banish poverty. Well, you get rid of poverty. You don't banish poor people from the public space. And so the two-pronged response I usually recommend is to start by saying something to the effect of, hey, we actually take very, very seriously our role of serving everyone in the entire community of every socioeconomic status, of every housing status. That's to kind of shame the illegitimate concern. And then follow up by saying, but we do take problematic behavior seriously, regardless of who is violating the rules, whether that person is homeless, not homeless, a student, an adult, whomever. And that kind of two-pronged response kind of soothes the legitimate concerns and shames the illegitimate ones. And my experience has been that works on probably 90% of individuals, and then the other 10% are just so offended at the sight of poverty and that poor people are allowed into their library, that there's really not much you can say to them, and that's a shame for them.
Madeline, maybe do you have a take on that as well?
Sure. I mean, I was thinking about, you know, in terms of, I don't know, I mean, I guess there's a difference, like what people say and what's actually happening. So someone might say, you know, they're always sleeping in the library, but they may not always be sleeping, because most libraries have policies about sleeping, and people aren't sleeping in the library. It's just someone's perception, and that everyone who's following any library guidelines is entitled to be sitting in the library. And if there are things that are happening that are not safe, then typically those things are addressed. And if they're not, they're brought to staff attention, but they're handled. So, you know, in terms of those angry people, I mean, it's about really, people do need to be heard. If they're feeling like it's their library, you know, it's just talking to people who don't want to hear another side is really challenging. But I think listening and having empathy for their side, whether or not you agree with it, is an important part of that process. And just making sure that they feel heard, and that you're letting them know that we all support a safe library that's accessible for everybody. And I think that some communities and municipalities have departments, like city departments, that handle mediation. And sometimes, you know, I've been thinking more about that our libraries should be working more with, you know, in any public-facing department, whether it's a library or, you know, rec and parks, or, you know, but working with the staff and helping them understand when it's something that needs to be referred to a mediator, to kind of talk it through, because when people can't get to the other side and you're dealing with it every day, you know, what can you do to help people get there? So I've been thinking about that a lot, but that's sort of new.
You said a line that I really like there, that we all support a safe library that's accessible for everyone. That's fantastic.
Well, I mean, I definitely think that that's a space we all want to be in, and I think it's, you know, it's hard for people see selectively, right? So they're just going to see what they want to see. So there may not be anyone sleeping in the library, but their perception is that this is what's happening when I walk in. So breaking conversations down is really helpful too, in that way.
And I think what you both, Ryan and Madeline, are pointing out, that it's not just a one size fits all. It's a community engagement process that also means that you have to work within the culture of your institution to try and make everything fit well. It's a little bit of a tension. It's a little bit of a paradox, but we serve everyone. There's been lots of questions, actually, I think, on the list, or on the chat rather, about identifying individuals, remaining and keeping the dignity of that individual, as well, and to remember that all of the people who come into our building are people who have different needs. And so as we balance these activities with many of the other priorities that we have within our library, I think one of the challenges we all have is actually how to make room for all of that, and not to supplant one for the other, which means that they may not all have the same sequence of importance in terms of support, but that we need to do our best to try to serve as many people as possible. We're sort of running a little bit low on time, so I'm just going to take maybe one more question, and this probably is meant for all of us, which is, how do you, when homelessness is hidden, how do you track and identify when it's happening while preserving the dignity of the individuals? So if you have something other than anecdotal evidence in order to convince politicians your area actually has the situation. And this comes from Alberta, Canada.
Wow, that's a big question. So I don't know how they do it in Canada. I think there's something relatively similar, but in the United States, HUD requires us to do a point-in-time count, where there's a certain night in the end of January every single year where the entire country, every single community in the country counts the number of individuals who are homeless in that community, looking at shelters, but also in most communities that's going to mean people actually going out in the streets and checking under bridges and checking in abandoned buildings and checking in forests and looking for people. And so that tends to become kind of the data that we use in the United States. I think I've heard somewhere that Canada does something similar. It's really hard to argue with kind of this federally mandated data. But convincing politicians is hard. Surely the data works, but in my experience, what works better is the relationship. You got to get someone who's actually living that experience, talking to the politician. I mean, the data's good, but the data without that human connection tends to be fairly weak in its impact on their voting habits.
I think that something. I don't really know if you're meaning capturing that in the community or capturing it at the library. But when we have an intake form for, it's a Google form that we use for the activities that we do related to working with unhoused populations. And generally, people have been very open about filling out the form, which helps us understand who we're working with. And I think that you could even have something, paper forms that are anonymous and people can fill out just as looking at what your community needs. And if you have a question there that helps people understand, you're working with a population because, out of our questionnaire we left out, all these people are answering that, all these services are aligned with services who, for people who are unhoused. And that's what we're seeing. But generally for us, the populations we've worked with have been very honest about their circumstances, even maybe if they're not visible to others. Just I think people who need help are usually they're okay to ask about it. So that's been our experience in terms of hidden populations, or I guess in trying to figure out if someone needs help or not.
Yeah, that's a much better answer than I gave, because that's probably what the question was actually asking. I just want to add one little tiny bit to that, and that my experience has been that most individuals are pretty honest about their housing status. They're actually shockingly honest about substance abuse issues. What they're not particularly honest about is mental health issues. And so we will have people in our shelter who will all the time say, oh yeah, I use heroin, I use cocaine, I use whatever. But they will never, ever discuss mental health issues with someone who they do not know really, really well, because the stigma around mental health is so just overwhelming, so much more than substance abuse, that's when we tend not to get honest answers.
Okay, so those are really thorny questions, and we're not going to be able to solve all of them, but I appreciate so much, Ryan and Madeline, you being here for this hour to talk about the really diverse needs within our community, and particularly around immigration and refugees, and also on homelessness, how it impacts all of our work as librarians. So this is the agenda as we're moving forward. There are 13 presentations within the next hour and a half, ranging from active shooter training, returning probationers, asylum seekers, healthcare, HIV/AIDS, opioid use, homelessness and poverty, and food insecurity, and gender diversity. We have presentations from El Salvador and Zambia, as well as throughout the U.S. And the one in particular on El Salvador is actually in Spanish, which is a very unique and wonderful opportunity for us. And that one is on particular on youth and gang violence, and how they're using the library as a resting place for those individuals. So we encourage you, please engage in all of the conversations that are happening. And if one doesn't suit you, take a look at another one. I think you'll see a rich diversity there. And if you could also join us at 2:30 Pacific for Rebecca Smith-Aldrich, who will also be presenting again on sustainability and resiliency. Thank you so much, everyone. And we look forward to your responses after you engage, and we hope that you've had a great hour with us and continue on with the work. Thank you.
Thanks, Patty. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Madeline. Okay, I'm going to turn off the recording now. Folks, you can leave the room and go to the next set of sessions. You'll notice I have to kick you out of the room if you haven't left so that the recording can process. The recordings will be up within a few minutes. The recording for this session will be. Thanks. Take care. Bye now.